My own parents stood in a Chicago courtroom and told a federal judge I was severely mentally incompetent and needed to be stripped of my basic human rights. Their lawyer confidently listed everything I owned, my downtown condo, my SUV, and my savings, demanding they be handed over to my sister and her husband immediately. They smiled at me from across the aisle, certain they were about to walk away with my entire life. They had no idea the judge was holding a sealed folder from the Securities and Exchange Commission that was about to turn their greed into a federal crime. I am Cassidy, 34 years old, and until that morning, I thought my family simply underestimated me. I never imagined they would attempt to legally destroy me. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against a toxic family who tried to tear you down. Your Honor, my client asks the court to intervene before her daughter ends up on the streets. Those words echoed off the walls, hanging in the air. Mr. Caldwell, my parents' expensive attorney, adjusted his suit and leaned over the podium. He spoke about me as if I were defective property. We are requesting an emergency conservatorship. We ask that control of Cassidy's condominium, her vehicle, and all banking accounts be transferred to her parents, Patricia and Richard, effective immediately. I sat frozen in my chair. This was not a family intervention. This was an ambush. I had been summoned here for a mediation hearing regarding a family dispute over a loan. Instead, I walked into a coordinated legal strike designed to strip me of my autonomy. My mother, Patricia, put on the performance of a lifetime. She clutched a tissue to her chest, her shoulders shaking with perfectly timed sobs. "She is so confused, Your Honor," my mother cried out, her voice cracking with manufactured grief. "We just want to save her from herself." My father, Richard, wrapped his arm around her shoulders. He nodded grimly, playing the stoic patriarch. He looked the judge in the eye and wiped away a non-existent tear. "It breaks my heart to do this," my father said, his voice dropping. "But Cassidy cannot manage her life. If we do not step in, she will take us all down." Behind my parents sat my younger sister, Brittany. At 30, she was the undisputed golden child. She rubbed her pregnant belly, dabbing at her eyes, but I could see the malicious gleam in her eyes. She was celebrating my downfall. Beside her sat her husband, Jamal. He was 32, a Black American investment broker, with a billboard smile and a sewer moral compass. He sat back, crossing one Italian leather shoe over the other. He smirked at me, checking his gold Rolex. That was the moment the puzzle clicked together. This was never about my mental health. This was about real estate and cash. Jamal and Brittany complained for months about living in a cramped apartment. Brittany whined about needing an upscale environment for her baby. My downtown condo, completely paid off and newly renovated, was the exact property they wanted. They had asked me to move out and let them have it at a family dinner 6 months ago. When I laughed and told them no, my parents called me a selfish failure. They said I was just a lowly IT support worker who did not need a luxury condo. They told me I should be honored to give up my home to support my sister. I refused, and the family went cold. But they did not let it go. They had simply regrouped, hired Mr. Caldwell, and plotted to take it by force. Mr. Caldwell paced slowly in front of the judge. "Your Honor, Cassidy works a low-level technical support job. She has no concept of financial literacy. Her family has watched her spiral into erratic behavior. If you do not grant this conservatorship today, her condo will fall into foreclosure. Her sister Brittany and brother-in-law Jamal have generously offered to move into the property to maintain it, while Cassidy receives the psychological help she desperately needs." I stared at Jamal. His smug smile widened. He actually winked at me. He thought he had outsmarted me. He thought he had manipulated the legal system right then to steal my home and hand it to his wife, all while painting me as a lunatic. He was an investment broker. He knew exactly how to use financial jargon to intimidate people. He had convinced my parents that this was a foolproof plan. They were going to declare me incompetent, legally seize my condo, drain my savings, and lock me away in some facility while they lived the high life on my dime. The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. They sat there in their expensive clothes, acting exactly like loving relatives, while actively trying to destroy my civil liberties. What none of them knew, what I had carefully hidden from them for 5 years, was that I was not a lowly IT support worker. I was not struggling or drowning in debt. I was the founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Financial Security, one of the fastest growing cybersecurity and financial technology firms in the Midwest. I had kept my wealth a secret because I knew exactly how greedy and toxic my family could be. I sat silently at the defense table, listening to Mr. Caldwell drone on about my incompetence. I did not scream or cry. I did not give them the erratic breakdown they were hoping for. I just sat there and waited. My attorney, Ms. Kensington, sat beside me, calmly organizing a stack of highly classified documents. We were about to let Jamal dig his own grave, and I was going to enjoy watching him fall into it. Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie before turning his full attention back to Judge Harrison. His voice carried a tone of manufactured pity, the kind of condescending sympathy reserved for wounded animals. Your Honor, we are dealing with a woman who has completely lost her grip on reality, he proclaimed, gesturing broadly toward where I sat. Cassidy is employed as a low-level IT help desk worker. Yet she somehow convinced herself she could maintain a luxury downtown condominium and a high-end SUV. This delusion of grandeur is a clear symptom of her deteriorating mental state. I kept my expression entirely neutral, resting my hands flat on the defense table. The lies were staggering in their precision. They had taken the vague job description I gave them years ago to avoid their constant demands for money and weaponized it. I told them I worked in IT support because it was easier than explaining cybersecurity infrastructure to people who only respected traditional titles like doctor or lawyer. Now they were using that exact cover story to paint me as a delusional failure. Patricia. My mother nodded along with Mr. Caldwell, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Richard. My father placed a comforting hand over hers. They looked like the perfect heartbroken parents. For 34 years, Patricia and Richard have poured their hearts into supporting this difficult child. Mr. Caldwell continued. While their younger daughter Brittany pursued a stable life, marrying a successful investment broker and preparing to welcome her first child, Cassidy has remained a constant source of anxiety. She has always been the family disappointment. She lives in a fantasy world where she pretends to be a successful professional while secretly drowning in debt. The sheer audacity of the narrative made me want to laugh out loud, but I held it in. I worked 80-hour weeks building my company from the ground up while they threw lavish parties and took credit for Jamal and his supposed financial wizardry. I missed holiday dinners because I was closing multi-million-dollar contracts with international clients, not because I was hiding in shame. Judge Harrison leaned forward. He was an older man. He looked at me with an unreadable expression. I knew what he was seeing. A quiet woman in a tailored gray suit, saying absolutely nothing to defend herself against these vicious allegations. He must have wondered why my attorney, Ms. Kensington, was just sitting there instead of objecting to the slander. Mr. Caldwell took my silence as a sign of weakness. He puffed out his chest, clearly believing he had already won the case. Your Honor, if we do not grant this conservatorship today, Cassidy will end up on the streets, he declared, his voice echoing dramatically. Her parents are stepping in purely out of love and mercy. They are willing to take on the enormous burden of managing her chaotic life. They are willing to let Brittany and Jamal assume the financial responsibilities of the condominium to save Cassidy from foreclosure. I glanced over my shoulder at the gallery. Brittany was stroking her pregnant belly, looking at me with an expression of pure triumph. She actually mouthed the words, "Pack your bags." Jamal sat next to her, radiating arrogance. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket and gave me a slight mocking nod. They truly believed they had executed the perfect crime. They wanted my home. They wanted my assets. They wanted me declared legally incompetent so they could strip away my agency and lock me out of my own life. And they were using my own parents as the Trojan horse to do it. I turned my attention back to the front of the room. Let them talk, I told myself. Let them build their entire case on a foundation of absolute lies. Every word Mr. Caldwell spoke today was being recorded by the court stenographer. They were digging a hole so deep they would never be able to climb out. Miss Kensington shifted slightly in the chair beside me. She leaned over, her voice barely a whisper meant only for my ears. Let him finish his fairy tale. The higher they climb, the harder the drop. I gave a microscopic nod in response. My parents had always viewed me as a punching bag, a convenient scapegoat they could use to make themselves feel superior. They spent their lives catering to Brittany, rewarding her entitlement, and ignoring my existence unless they needed someone to belittle. Now they had brought their toxic circus into a federal courtroom, demanding the legal system validate their delusions. Your Honor, Mr. Caldwell concluded, stepping back to stand beside my parents. We have expert testimony to corroborate these claims. We have financial documentation proving Cassidy is on the brink of total collapse. We ask you to grant this conservatorship to protect this young woman from her own tragic incompetence. Judge Harrison nodded slowly, adjusting his glasses. He looked over the initial filings, then turned his stern gaze toward our table. Mr. Caldwell, you have made some very serious claims regarding the respondent's mental and financial state, Judge Harrison stated firmly. You mentioned expert testimony and financial documentation. I assume you are prepared to present this evidence to the court today. Absolutely, Your Honor, Mr. Caldwell replied eagerly, vibrating with confidence. We would like to call our first witness to the stand. An expert in financial management and investment brokerage who has personally reviewed Cassidy's disastrous financial records. We call Jamal to the stand. My heart beat with a steady, rhythmic calm. The game was finally beginning. I watched as Jamal stood up from the gallery, smoothing his expensive tie and buttoning his jacket. He walked down the aisle with the swagger of a man who believed he owned the world. He raised his right hand, swearing to tell the truth, a promise he was about to break in spectacular fashion. I sat perfectly still, waiting for the trap to spring shut. Jamal settled into the wooden chair of the witness box with the practiced ease of a man completely at home in high-pressure environments. He adjusted the lapels of his custom-tailored suit and offered Judge Harrison a respectful, deferential smile. It was a masterful performance from the very first second. Mr. Caldwell approached the podium, clasping his hands together and radiating satisfaction. Please state your name and profession for the record, Mr. Caldwell began. My name is Jamal, and I am a senior investment broker at Vanguard Financial Partners. Jamal replied, his voice smooth and projecting perfectly across the quiet courtroom. I hold multiple advanced certifications in wealth management, asset allocation, and risk assessment. I have spent the last 8 years helping high-net-worth individuals secure their financial futures. Judge Harrison nodded, acknowledging the impressive credentials. Jamal knew exactly how to play this room. He was not just the concerned brother-in-law. He was presenting himself as a certified expert, lending the weight of his profession to my parents' absurd claims. Mr. Caldwell paced slowly, letting the silence build. Jamal, you are married to Cassidy's sister Brittany, correct? That is correct, sir, Jamal answered, letting a touch of manufactured sadness enter his voice. Brittany and I have been married for 3 years. We love Cassidy very much, which is why being here today is so incredibly difficult for all of us. I watched him sell this lie with absolute conviction. He looked at my parents in the gallery, offering them a reassuring glance before turning his attention back to the lawyer. Mr. Caldwell leaned against the wooden railing of the jury box. Can you tell the court what prompted you to investigate Cassidy's financial situation? Jamal sighed heavily, resting his hands on his lap. It started a few months ago. Patricia and Richard Cassidy's parents came to me extremely worried. They mentioned that Cassidy was acting erratically, avoiding family gatherings, and becoming highly defensive whenever the topic of money came up. As a financial professional, I know these are classic red flags for severe monetary distress. I offered to help look into things out of pure brotherly concern. I wanted to see if I could offer her some pro bono restructuring advice before things got out of hand. The sheer hypocrisy of his statement was breathtaking. 6 months ago, when I refused to hand over my condo, He had screamed at me in my own hallway, calling me a selfish failure. Now he was sitting under oath, spinning a fairy tale about his benevolent desire to provide pro bono restructuring advice. He was painting me as a charity case he had generously tried to rescue. "And what did your professional review uncover?" Mr. Caldwell asked, prompting the next phase of the attack. Jamal shook his head slowly, looking directly at Judge Harrison. "Your Honor, what I found was a complete financial disaster. Cassidy is living in a house of cards. She maintains a luxury downtown condominium and drives a $90,000 vehicle on the salary of a basic IT help desk technician. She has been funding this lifestyle entirely through aggressive borrowing and predatory credit lines. She is completely underwater." Mr. Caldwell stepped forward, handing a stack of papers to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. The documents were thick, heavy with numbers and graphs designed to look intimidatingly official. "These are the financial summaries I prepared based on my findings," Jamal continued confidently. "Cassidy has leveraged every single asset she possesses. She has taken out massive unsecured loans to maintain the illusion of success. She is currently drowning in over $400,000 of high-interest debt. She is delinquent on multiple credit cards and has been taking out margin loans simply to pay the minimum balances on her other accounts. It is a textbook debt spiral." I listened carefully, committing every lie to memory. Margin loans. He actually used the term margin loans. It was a sophisticated financial instrument rarely available to a simple IT worker, but perfectly accessible to a corrupt investment broker. Jamal was too arrogant to realize that his fabricated story was entirely too complex for the character they had assigned me. He was projecting his own financial mechanisms onto my life. Jamal leaned forward, engaging directly with the judge. "Your Honor, I have seen cases like this before in my professional practice. When individuals cannot cope with reality, they construct a fragile facade. Cassidy has built a life she cannot afford to impress people who do not care. My in-laws are offering a lifeline. They are offering to take on a massive burden purely out of parental devotion. It is a sacrifice most families would run away from. But Patricia and Richard are willing to sacrifice their own peace of mind to save their daughter from financial ruin." I glanced over at my parents. My mother was actually weeping into her hands, nodding along to Jamal's brilliant performance. My father was staring at the floor, playing the part of a broken man crushed by his daughter's failures. It was a masterclass in manipulation. They had orchestrated this entire narrative to justify stealing my property. If I had actually been the helpless IT worker they claimed I was, this testimony would have destroyed me. I would have been stripped of my home, my money, and my independence right there on the spot. But I was not helpless. Ms. Kensington sat next to me, her posture completely relaxed. She was taking meticulous notes, her pen gliding across the legal pad. She did not interrupt. She did not raise a single objection. She let Mr. Caldwell and Jamal build their towering monument of deceit without any interference. In the legal world, giving a hostile witness enough rope to hang themselves was a dangerous game, but we knew exactly what we were doing. Mr. Caldwell flipped through his own copy of the documents. "In your expert opinion, Jamal, is Cassidy capable of managing her own finances or averting this impending ruin?" "Absolutely not," Jamal answered without hesitation. "She lacks the basic financial literacy required to comprehend the danger she is in. She is hiding from her creditors and lying to her family. If this court does not intervene and place her under the conservatorship of her parents, she will face bankruptcy within the month. She will lose the condominium anyway to foreclosure. My wife and I are simply offering to step in, assume the property, and manage the debt to protect her from total destitution." Mr. Caldwell walked back to the podium, looking immensely satisfied with himself. "So to summarize your expert testimony, Jamal, you believe that without immediate legal intervention by this court, Cassidy will suffer irreparable financial and psychological harm. Is that correct?" Jamal looked me right in the eye, his arrogant smirk returning for a fraction of a second before he replaced it with a mask of solemn concern. "Yes, sir. Without a conservatorship, she will lose everything. We are just trying to catch her before she hits the ground." Mr. Caldwell turned to the judge. "Thank you, Jamal. I have no further questions for this witness, Your Honor." The courtroom fell silent. The family had played their strongest card. They had presented motive expert testimony and a compelling emotional narrative. They believed they had effectively cornered me. Now it was our turn. Judge Harrison peered over his reading glasses at our table. Does the defense wish to cross-examine the witness? Ms. Kensington stood up slowly, deliberately smoothing the front of her blazer. Not quite yet, Your Honor, she replied, her voice calm and authoritative. However, we would like to review the physical exhibits. Plaintiff counsel just entered into evidence. The financial documents Mr. Jamal claims to have reviewed. Judge Harrison nodded, signaling the bailiff. The uniformed officer collected the thick stack of papers from Mr. Caldwell and carried them across the aisle, dropping them onto our defense table with a heavy thud. The sound echoed in the quiet courtroom. I stared at the glossy white pages resting on the polished oak. These were the instruments of my supposed destruction. Take your time, Ms. Kensington said quietly, pushing the stack toward me. Look closely. I picked up the top sheet. It was a bank statement bearing the logo of a major national bank. My name and condo address were printed perfectly in the top left corner. The account numbers looked authentic. Below, my personal information columns of red numbers cascaded down the page, detailing massive overdraft fees, missed payments, and maxed-out credit lines. The next page was a default notice from a mortgage lender threatening immediate foreclosure proceedings. The third was a letter from a collection agency. The sheer level of detail was staggering. Jamal had not just typed up a few fake numbers on a spreadsheet. He had manufactured a comprehensive, flawless, alternate reality. He had perfectly replicated institutional fonts, watermarks, and legal disclaimers. To an untrained eye, or even to a busy federal judge, these looked like undeniable proof of financial ruin. But as I stared at a specific account number on the second page, a cold realization washed over me. I recognized that account number. It was not a fake sequence of digits. It was the routing and account number for an old dormant checking account I had opened years ago to handle automated utility bills. An account I had not used in over a year. My vision tunneled as a memory slammed into my mind with the force of a freight train. It was 6 months ago. The infamous family dinner at my condo, the exact night I refused to hand over my home to Brittany and Jamal. The dinner had started with forced smiles and passive-aggressive comments from my mother about my simple furniture. We had finished eating, and the tension was already simmering. Jamal had stood up, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin, and asked to use the restroom. I directed him down the hall. The guest bathroom was the second door on the left. The first door on the left was my home office. In my memory, I could see him walking down that hallway. I remembered sitting at the dining table listening to my father complain about the traffic while Brittany complained about her pregnancy cravings. 10 minutes passed, then 15. My mother made a remark about Jamal taking his time. I had stood up intending to check on him. As I rounded the corner into the hallway, I saw him. He was not coming out of the bathroom. He was stepping out of my home office. He had jumped slightly when he saw me hastily shoving his hands into his tailored pockets. He flashed that brilliant, arrogant smile, claiming he had simply taken a wrong turn and gotten turned around looking for the guest bath. I had narrowed my eyes at the flimsy excuse, but the ensuing argument about the condo had completely overshadowed the bizarre encounter. Sitting in the courtroom, the pieces violently snapped together. He had not taken a wrong turn. He had gone straight into my office. I always kept a stack of unsorted mail in a wire basket on my desk. Old bank statements, utility bills, junk mail. He had stood in my private sanctuary while I served his wife dinner, and he had systematically photographed or stolen my discarded mail. He harvested my account numbers, my routing details, the exact formatting of my bank correspondence, and my signature from old documents. He used that stolen information to craft these forgeries. He used my real dormant account numbers as the foundation to build this fictional mountain of debt, making the documents look incredibly authentic to anyone who tried to run a basic verification check. It was a masterful piece of identity theft executed by a man who made his living moving money around in the shadows. A wave of nausea hit me, followed instantly by a surge of white-hot fury. They had not just lied to a judge. They had invaded my home, violated my privacy, and stolen my identity. I tapped my finger against the dormant account number on the forged statement. I leaned closer to Ms. Kensington, keeping my eyes locked on the paper. "He stole my mail." I whispered the words, tasting like ash. 6 months ago, during a family dinner at my place, he went into my home office. "This account number right here is real. It is a dead account I used for water bills. He harvested my data to make these look legitimate." Ms. Kensington did not gasp. She did not look shocked. A slow, predatory smile touched the corners of her mouth. Her eyes glinted with the thrill of the kill. "I was wondering how he got the formatting so perfect," she murmured back seamlessly, sliding the document toward herself. "Identity theft and mail fraud, federal offenses. He really outdid himself today." I looked up from the table straight across the room. Jamal was watching us from the witness box, his posture relaxed. He probably thought we were panicking over the flawless quality of his fake evidence. He probably thought I was explaining to my lawyer that my life was over. He had no idea that I had just handed Ms. Kensington the exact weapon she needed to destroy him. "Are you ready?" Ms. Kensington asked me, her tone shifting into pure professional steel. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the anger fuel me rather than blind me. "Burn him to the ground," I replied. Ms. Kensington stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. She picked up the forged bank statements and walked confidently toward the center of the courtroom. The air in the room seemed to shift, crackling with sudden electricity. Mr. Caldwell leaned forward at the plaintiff table, his smug expression faltering slightly as he tried to read Miss Kensington's demeanor. My parents watched her with narrowed, suspicious eyes. "Your Honor," Ms. Kensington said, her voice ringing out clear and sharp. "The defense has reviewed the exhibits provided by opposing counsel. We are now ready to cross-examine the witness." "Proceed," Judge Harrison instructed, folding his hands together and resting his chin on them. Ms. Kensington approached the witness stand, holding the documents casually in one hand. She did not look angry or intimidated. She looked like a predator playing with its food. Jamal offered her a polite, condescending smile, clearly under the impression that he was the smartest person in the room. He was about to learn a very painful lesson about underestimating the women standing before him. Ms. Kensington stopped right at the edge of the witness box. She looked at Jamal, holding the forged documents loosely at her side. Then she did something that caught everyone off guard. She turned her back on him and faced the bench. "Your Honor, the defense reserves the right to cross-examine Mr. Jamal after the plaintiff calls the rest of their witnesses. We believe it will save the court a considerable amount of time." Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Very well. The witness may step down for now." Jamal blinked, his smug smile faltering for a fraction of a second. He had braced himself for a fight, ready to dazzle the court with more financial jargon. Being dismissed so casually clearly bruised his ego. He stood up, adjusted his suit jacket, and strutted back to the gallery, whispering something into my father's ear as he sat down. "Call your next witness, Mr. Caldwell," the judge instructed. "The plaintiff calls Brittany," Caldwell announced, his voice dripping with theatrical gravity. My younger sister stood up from the wooden bench. She did not just walk to the witness stand, she performed. She moved with exaggerated care, her hand resting protectively over the small bump of her stomach. She wore a soft pastel maternity dress designed to make her look innocent, fragile, and utterly wholesome. She cast a sorrowful glance in my direction before stepping up to take the oath. "Please state your name and your relationship to the respondent," Caldwell requested, softly treating her as if she were made of glass. "My name is Brittany," she replied, her voice trembling perfectly on cue. "I am Cassidy's younger sister." "And how would you describe your relationship with your sister Brittany?" "We used to be so close," she lied smoothly, gripping the edges of the witness stand. I looked up to her, but lately she has become someone I do not even recognize. It breaks my heart to see her this way. I dug my fingernails into my palms. We were never close. From the time we were children, Brittany made it her mission to undermine me. If I got a good grade, she threw a tantrum until my parents bought her a toy to compensate. If I made a friend, she spread rumors until they stopped speaking to me. Now she was using a federal courtroom as her personal theater stage. Can you describe what you have witnessed regarding Cassidy's behavior? Caldwell prompted. Brittany took a shaky breath. She isolates herself. She ignores our calls. When we try to visit her, she is defensive and paranoid. She lives in this massive, expensive downtown condo, but she is completely overwhelmed by it. Jamal tried to help her with her bills and she practically threw us out. She is unstable hiding in that apartment while her life falls apart. The sheer entitlement radiating from her was suffocating. She was standing under oath, weaving a tragic narrative to cover up the fact that I had simply set a boundary and told them to get out of my home. It must be incredibly stressful for your family, Caldwell coaxed. What solution are your parents proposing to help Cassidy? Brittany sniffled, wiping a dry eye. My parents love her so much. They have a beautifully finished basement in their home in the suburbs. It is quiet, safe, and completely removed from the stress of the city. We believe Cassidy needs to move back home. She can live in the basement rent-free where my parents can monitor her health, ensure she is eating, and help her get the psychological treatment she desperately needs. I felt a sickening lurch in my stomach. The basement. They wanted to strip me of my wealth, erase my independence, and shove me into my parents' basement like a dirty secret. They wanted to reduce me to a helpless dependent entirely reliant on the very people who despised me. And what about the downtown condominium? Caldwell asked, leading her right into the trap they had carefully laid out. As we established, Cassidy is facing severe financial delinquency. What is the family's plan for the property to prevent foreclosure? This was it. The entire reason we were sitting in this courtroom. I watched Brittany's eyes light up. The sorrowful sister act vanished for a split second, replaced by naked, unadulterated greed. Jamal and I have discussed it extensively. Brittany said, her hand returning to her pregnant belly. We cannot bear to see my sister's credit ruined, and we cannot let a family asset be seized by the bank. We are willing to make a massive sacrifice. Jamal and I will assume the deed to the condo. We will take over the financial burden so Cassidy does not have to worry about it. She paused, letting the magnitude of her fake generosity sink in before delivering the final sickening blow. With the baby coming, we really need a safe, secure environment. Brittany continued, her voice taking on a sickly sweet tone. The city is so expensive, but raising our growing family in Cassidy's condo would be a blessing. I have already looked at the guest room. It gets wonderful morning light. It would make a perfect nursery for her future niece or nephew. It keeps the home in the family, and it gives Cassidy the freedom to heal in the basement without the crushing weight of a mortgage. My blood boiled. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of her words felt like a physical strike. She was not just asking a judge to steal my home. She had already mentally decorated it. She had walked through my condo during that disastrous dinner 6 months ago, measured my guest room, decided it would be her nursery, and then conspired with her husband to forge federal financial documents to make it happen. They had weaponized the legal system to facilitate a real estate upgrade. I turned to look at the gallery. My parents were nodding in solemn agreement. They looked like proud, benevolent figures making a tough but loving choice. They were completely on board with stealing my property to subsidize their golden child's lifestyle. My vision swam with red-hot anger. I wanted to stand up and scream. I wanted to tell the judge that the condo was paid off in full with cash 3 years ago. I wanted to shout that the only people drowning in debt were the pathetic parasites sitting across the aisle. I gripped the edge of the heavy oak table so hard my knuckles turned white. Ms. Kensington must have sensed the violent spike in my blood pressure. Without taking her eyes off Brittany, she slid her hand over, pressing 2 firm fingers against my forearm. Patience, Ms. Kensington whispered, her voice an icy razor. Let her claim the throne. It makes the guillotine swing that much faster. I forced my muscles to relax, exhaling a slow, measured breath. Ms. Kensington was right. Brittany was sealing her own fate with every word she spoke. She was testifying under oath that she intended to take possession of the property based on the forged documents her husband had submitted. She was implicating herself directly in the fraud. Caldwell beamed at Brittany as if she were a saint descending from the heavens. Thank you for your incredible sacrifice, Brittany. It takes a truly loving sister to take on such a massive financial burden to save her family. He turned to the judge. I have no further questions for this witness, Your Honor. Judge Harrison looked down at his notes, his face an impenetrable mask of judicial neutrality. He then looked over at our table. Ms. Kensington, does the defense wish to cross-examine this witness? Ms. Kensington stood up, her presence commanding the room instantly. Not at this moment, Your Honor. As with the previous witness, we reserve the right to cross-examine after the plaintiff concludes their direct testimonies. Judge Harrison frowned slightly but nodded. Very well, the witness is excused. Brittany stepped down from the stand, casting one last pitiful, lingering look in my direction before returning to her seat next to Jamal. He wrapped his arm around her, kissing her temple. They looked so victorious. They believed the hard part was over. They had painted the perfect picture of a tragic, incompetent sister and a loving, self-sacrificing family. But the show was not over yet. They still had one more act in their circus of lies, and I was going to sit right here and let them perform it. Mr. Caldwell turned toward the gallery with a solemn expression. The plaintiff calls Patricia to the stand. My mother stood up slowly. She was dressed in a conservative beige suit, her hair perfectly styled to look elegant, yet appropriately distressed. She leaned heavily on my father for a moment before making her way down the aisle. She walked with the weary shuffle of a martyr, carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. She stepped into the witness box, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Another meaningless oath in a room rapidly filling with perjury. Mr. Caldwell approached her with the gentle demeanor of a grief counselor. Please state your name for the court. My name is Patricia, she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. I am Cassidy's mother. Mr. Caldwell offered a sympathetic nod. Patricia, this must be incredibly difficult for you. Can you tell the court why you felt compelled to file for an emergency conservatorship over your own daughter? My mother looked down at her hands, twisting a tissue between her fingers. Because I am terrified, she said, looking up at Judge Harrison with wide, pleading eyes. I am terrified that if we do not intervene today, my daughter is going to die. She has always been a difficult child, Your Honor. While Brittany was social and well-adjusted, Cassidy was withdrawn and prone to extreme emotional outbursts. We tried everything to help her. Therapy, counseling, endless patience. But lately her condition has deteriorated into something truly frightening. I sat rigid in my chair. Difficult. That was the word she always used to describe me whenever I set a boundary or refused to be a pawn in her social climbing games. I was not withdrawn as a child. I was simply exhausted from trying to earn affection that was exclusively reserved for Brittany. Every achievement I ever earned was met with a blank stare, while Brittany's most mediocre accomplishments were celebrated with lavish dinners. Now Patricia was using the distance she created to prove my supposed mental instability. Can you describe a specific incident that highlights this deterioration? Mr. Caldwell prompted, guiding her exactly where they had practiced. Patricia took a shuddering breath. It was about 2 years ago. I went to her condominium to drop off some groceries because she had been ignoring our calls for weeks. When I let myself in, the state of the apartment was horrifying. It looked like a disaster zone. Papers everywhere, empty coffee cups stacked on the desk, the blinds pulled tight in the middle of the day. She paused, letting a perfectly timed tear roll down her cheek. And then I found Cassidy. She was collapsed on the sofa, wearing the same clothes she had worn days prior. She was pale, shaking, and completely incoherent. She kept muttering about firewalls and system breaches and security protocols. She was having a complete psychological collapse right in front of me. I begged her to let me take her to a hospital, but she screamed at me to get out. She was completely unhinged. The sheer manipulation of her testimony left me breathless. I remembered that day with crystal clarity. 2 years ago, my company, Aegis Financial Security, was in the final stages of securing our first massive enterprise contract. Our servers had faced a highly sophisticated brute force cyber attack from an overseas syndicate. For 6 days straight, I had not slept for more than 40 minutes at a time. I was running entirely on adrenaline, caffeine, and sheer willpower, writing code and patching security vulnerabilities to keep my clients' financial data from being compromised. I had single-handedly stopped a massive data breach, saving millions of dollars. I was physically and mentally exhausted from pulling 80-hour work weeks to build a multi-million-dollar company in absolute secrecy. When my mother barged into my home uninvited, using a spare key she had stolen, demanding to know why I had missed some trivial family brunch, I had simply been too tired to deal with her entitlement. I had asked her to leave because I needed to sleep. I had successfully protected my empire, and all I wanted was a few hours of peace. Now she was weaponizing my exhaustion. She was twisting the hardest professional battle of my life into a psychotic break. She was using my dedication as proof of my insanity to steal the very assets my hard work had paid for. It broke my heart to leave her there, Patricia sobbed, wiping her eyes. But she became so aggressive. That was when Richard and I realized she was not just struggling with a demanding help desk job. She was suffering from severe delusions. She talks about international clients and security threats as if she were a secret agent. It is a textbook fantasy world she created to cope with her massive financial failures. Mr. Caldwell turned to the judge, spreading his hands. Your Honor, what Patricia is describing is a profound disconnect from reality. Cassidy has constructed an alternate identity to escape the crushing reality of her $400,000 in debt. She has built a wall of lies to keep her family away because she knows they will expose her incompetence. Patricia leaned forward, gripping the railing of the witness stand, her knuckles turning white. Please, Your Honor, she begged, her voice trembling with manufactured desperation. You have to grant this conservatorship today. If you let her walk out of this courtroom with access to her bank accounts and her car, she will destroy herself. She cannot manage her own life. We just want to bring her home to our basement where we can keep her safe. We want to clear her debts by letting Jamal and Brittany handle the property. We just want to save our little girl. Her performance was flawless. If I had not lived the reality of her cruelty, I might have believed her myself. She sounded like a desperate mother pleading for her child's life. She did not sound like a greedy parasite trying to legally enslave her daughter for real estate. The fake tears running down her cheeks were a masterclass in emotional manipulation, designed solely to secure a luxurious future for Brittany and Jamal at my expense. Judge Harrison looked visibly moved. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Cases involving mental health and family disputes were notoriously tricky, but my parents had painted a masterpiece of deception. They had provided a motive, a solution, and an expert witness to back it all up. Thank you, Patricia, Mr. Caldwell said softly. I have no further questions. Judge Harrison looked over at our table. Ms. Kensington, do you have any questions for this witness? I looked at Ms. Kensington. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. My mother had just stood in a federal courtroom and character assassinated me with surgical precision. She had stripped away my dignity, my hard work, and my sanity in under 10 minutes. Miss Kensington met my gaze. Her eyes were calm, unbothered, and dangerously sharp. She gave me that same microscopic nod. The setup was complete. They had laid out every single lie perfectly on the record. Mr. Caldwell knew exactly how to capitalize on a dramatic moment. He let the silence stretch, allowing my mother's fabricated tears to echo faintly in the cavernous courtroom. He walked back to the plaintiff's table and picked up the thick stack of forged financial documents Jamal had provided. His face was a mask of grave concern, but I could see the predatory gleam in his eyes. He believed he was holding the final nail for my coffin. Your Honor, Mr. Caldwell began, his voice echoing with absolute authority. We have heard the tragic testimony of a mother desperate to save her child. We have seen the objective financial data provided by a certified investment broker, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the respondent is in the midst of a catastrophic debt spiral. We have heard how Cassidy has isolated herself, living in a state of delusion while her real world crumbles around her. The family has presented a clear, viable, and compassionate solution to prevent her total ruin. He stepped closer to the bench, holding the forged papers out like a shield. "We cannot wait for standard legal timelines to unfold," Mr. Caldwell declared. "Every single hour that Cassidy remains in control of her finances is another hour she can further damage her credit, incur more predatory debt, or liquidate assets in a state of psychological panic. Her creditors are circling. Foreclosure is imminent. If this court delays action, we risk allowing this young woman to destroy herself completely." Caldwell turned slightly, making sure the gallery and the judge could see his earnest expression. "Therefore, Your Honor, we are pushing for an immediate emergency freeze on all of Cassidy's assets. We request that you sign the injunction right now, placing her bank accounts, vehicle, and condominium under the temporary legal control of Patricia and Richard. Furthermore, we request that Jamal and Brittany be granted immediate access to the property to begin mitigating the financial damage and preparing the residents for their growing family. It is the only way to protect the asset from bank seizure." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on my lap. The sheer greed on display was staggering. They were not even trying to hide their eagerness to strip my home away from me anymore. They had dressed up their theft as a rescue mission, and they were begging the judge to hand over the keys immediately. Judge Harrison looked over his reading glasses, his brow furrowed in deep contemplation. He looked down at the forged documents Jamal had so carefully manufactured. The fake red lines of debt, the fabricated late notices, the stolen account numbers used to build a fictional disaster. To a judge whose primary job was to interpret the evidence placed in front of him, the narrative was incredibly compelling. He had no reason to suspect that a licensed financial broker would commit federal perjury in his courtroom. "This is a highly unusual and severe request, Mr. Caldwell," Judge Harrison said slowly, his voice betraying a hint of hesitation. "Stripping an adult of their financial autonomy on an emergency basis is not something this court takes lightly." "I know, Your Honor," Caldwell pressed, leaning into the microphone. "But these are severe circumstances. You have seen the paperwork. You have heard the testimony." The respondent has sat there completely silent throughout these proceedings. She has offered no defense, no explanation, and no rational counterargument to her mother's heartbreaking account of her mental collapse. Her very silence is indicative of her disconnection from reality. Judge Harrison turned his gaze directly toward me. His eyes searched my face, looking for any sign of the erratic, unhinged woman my mother had just described. I kept my posture straight, my breathing even, and my expression completely blank. I did not glare at my parents. I did not scowl at Caldwell. I simply looked back at the judge with calm, steady respect. Ms. Kensington sat beside me, a statue of absolute professional composure. She was waiting for the tension to reach its absolute breaking point. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. I could hear the scratching of the court reporter's machine, and I could hear the soft, smug whispers coming from the gallery behind me. I did not need to turn around to know what my family was doing. I could feel their victory radiating through the room. Richard had pulled Patricia into a comforting embrace, playing the role of the exhausted but relieved father. Jamal shifted in his seat, the leather of his expensive shoes squeaking slightly as he leaned over to whisper into Brittany's ear. They were already celebrating. I caught a brief reflection of them in the polished wood of the defense table. Brittany was beaming. Her hands were resting on her pregnant belly, but she was practically vibrating with excitement. She was probably already mentally picking out paint colors for my guest room. Jamal had a smirk plastered across his face, looking at my back as if I were a minor obstacle he had effortlessly swatted out of his way. They thought they had won. They thought the judge was going to sign his name on a piece of paper and hand them my entire life on a silver platter. Judge Harrison sighed heavily, picking up his pen. He looked at the emergency injunction document Mr. Caldwell had placed before him, the document that would freeze my bank accounts, lock me out of my condo, and turn me into a legal dependent of the people who despised me. "Ms. Kensington, I must ask you directly," Judge Harrison said, holding the pen above the paper. "Your client has remained entirely mute. You have declined to cross-examine any of the plaintiff's witnesses thus far. You have offered no alternative financial documentation to dispute Mr. Jamal's expert testimony. The evidence before me paints a very dire picture of your client's capacity to manage her affairs. Does the defense have anything at all to say before I sign this emergency order? The world seemed to slow down. My parents held their breath. Jamal sat up straighter, waiting for the final blow. Mr. Caldwell offered a patronizing smile to Miss Kensington, fully expecting her to offer some weak procedural delay. They had pushed me to the absolute edge of the cliff. One stroke of the judge's pen and my assets would be temporarily frozen, tying my company and my life up in a messy legal battle for months. The tension peaked. The trap was fully set. The bait had been taken. Ms. Kensington stood up. She did not rush. She moved with the slow, deliberate grace of an executioner stepping up to the block. She adjusted her blazer, picked up her legal pad, and looked directly at Mr. Caldwell before turning her gaze to the judge. "Yes, Your Honor," Ms. Kensington said, her voice ringing out like a cracked whip in the silent room. "The defense has quite a lot to say. In fact, we are finally ready to begin our cross-examination." The air in the courtroom instantly shifted. The smug smiles in the gallery faltered. Mr. Caldwell's patronizing expression froze on his face. Miss Kensington had not stood up to plead for mercy. She had stood up to go to war. "We request that Jamal be recalled to the witness stand immediately," Miss Kensington demanded, her eyes locking onto my brother-in-law. "We have some very specific questions about his expert financial methodology." Judge Harrison lowered his pen slowly, placing it back on his desk. The emergency order remained unsigned. The victory my family had just been tasting turned to ash in their mouths. The real trial was just beginning. Jamal walked back to the witness stand with the same arrogant stride he had used earlier. He buttoned his suit jacket, offering Judge Harrison a polite nod. He looked completely unworried. He looked mildly annoyed, like a man forced to explain simple arithmetic to a slow child. He adjusted his cuffs, his gold Rolex catching the fluorescent lights of the courtroom. He believed his forged narrative was bulletproof, and that I was mere collateral damage in his quest for a real estate upgrade. Miss Kensington did not approach the podium immediately. She took her time. She picked up the thick stack of financial documents, weighing them in her hands as if judging their physical mass. The room remained silent. Patricia and Richard shifted uncomfortably in the gallery, their earlier performance of weeping parents momentarily suspended. Brittany crossed her arms over her maternity dress, her smug smile replaced by a tight, nervous line. They had expected us to beg for mercy. They did not expect calculated silence. Finally, Miss Kensington stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. She did not put on a theatrical display of righteous indignation. She bypassed emotional manipulation and went straight to the numbers. She knew that in a federal courtroom, math was the only universal language. "You stated earlier you are a senior investment broker. Is that correct?" Ms. Kensington asked, her tone conversational but sharp. "That is correct," Jamal replied, leaning back in his chair. "I deal exclusively with high net worth individuals managing complex portfolios and mitigating risk." "Excellent," Ms. Kensington said, stepping closer. "So you possess an advanced understanding of banking protocols, credit lines, and institutional lending. You deeply understand the mechanics of debt." "I do," Jamal answered, puffing his chest out slightly. "It is quite literally my job, which is why I could so easily identify the catastrophic financial spiral my sister-in-law was hiding from her family. It takes a professional to fully comprehend the magnitude of the disaster she has created." I watched him from the defense table, keeping my face a blank slate. He could not resist the urge to brag, to position himself as the smartest person in the room. He was handing Miss Kensington the exact ammunition she needed to execute him legally. Miss Kensington held up the forged statements. "Let us discuss your methodology, Jamal. You claim she is drowning in debt. Can you explain exactly how you compiled this comprehensive financial audit?" Jamal offered a condescending smile. "It was not difficult. Cassidy has been incredibly careless. During a family dinner at her condominium 6 months ago, I noticed several final notice bills left openly on her kitchen counter. Later, my mother-in-law Patricia provided me with additional mail that had accidentally been forwarded to their suburban home. Using my professional background, I synthesized this information to create the summary you see before you. I simply connected the dots. It was a smooth lie, seamlessly blending his fabricated narrative with a perfectly plausible excuse. So you connected the dots. Ms. Kensington repeated, her voice dripping with sudden icy precision. You took a few stray pieces of mail and constructed an extensive forensic audit of her liabilities. You must be very good at your job. I am, Jamal said, his arrogance blinding him to the sarcasm. Ms. Kensington walked back to our table and pulled a single sheet of paper from the stack. She handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to Jamal. Let us look at page 4 of your audit. You specifically claim that Cassidy has been utilizing margin loans to cover her minimum credit card payments. You stated this under oath just 20 minutes ago. Yes, Jamal replied, glancing at the paper. That is exactly what she is doing. For the benefit of the court, Ms. Kensington said, pacing slowly. Could you explain what a margin loan is? Keep it simple for those of us who do not manage high net worth portfolios. Jamal sighed, clearly relishing the opportunity to lecture. A margin loan is a mechanism where an investor borrows money from their brokerage firm using their existing investment portfolio as collateral. It is incredibly dangerous because if the portfolio value drops, the brokerage issues a margin call, forcing the immediate repayment of the loan. And according to your expert analysis, Ms. Kensington said, tapping her pen against her chin, my client, who you have repeatedly characterized as an IT help desk worker with zero financial literacy, managed to secure a massive margin loan. Jamal hesitated. The trap was beginning to take shape, but he could not see the jaws closing yet. Desperate people find a way, he answered smoothly. She likely opened a basic brokerage account years ago, deposited her meager savings, and leveraged it to the absolute limit. People get access to financial tools they do not understand and hang themselves with them. Ms. Kensington stopped pacing. So to be absolutely clear, you are testifying under penalty of perjury that Cassidy initiated these margin loans herself. You are stating that these accounts and the corresponding debt are tied directly to her personal financial profile. I am, Jamal stated firmly, his voice echoing in the quiet courtroom. The documentation clearly shows the debt is in her name. The margin loans are actively draining what little equity she has left. It is undeniable proof of her incompetence. I watched, feeling a cold thrill. He had sworn under oath in front of a federal judge that the margin loans were real and directly linked to me. He was so confident in his forgery that he never stopped to consider why my attorney was asking these specific questions. He thought he was explaining my ruin. He did not realize he was explaining his own criminal methodology. Ms. Kensington had given him the rope, and Jamal had just tied the noose securely around his own neck. The courtroom was silent, waiting for the defense to crumble. Instead, Ms. Kensington smiled very coldly. Ms. Kensington stepped closer to the witness box. Her voice remained perfectly level, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Let us look closer at these margin loans you are so certain about, she said. You testified that my client leveraged a basic retail brokerage account to access these funds. According to your exhibit on page 4, the margin maintenance requirement is listed at 25%. Jamal nodded quickly. That is a standard industry requirement for retail accounts. When her equity fell below 25%, the broker issued a margin call. It is basic finance. Ms. Kensington did not miss a beat. Basic finance indeed. But let us look at the mathematics you submitted under oath. You list the portfolio value at $50,000 and the borrowed amount at $200,000. Jamal shifted his weight. His tailored suit suddenly looked a little too tight around the collar. Yes. She over-leveraged herself completely. Miss Kensington tilted her head. Are you sure about those numbers, Jamal? Because according to Regulation T of the Federal Reserve Board, a retail investor can only borrow up to 50% of the purchase price of securities on margin. Yet, your documentation shows my client somehow borrowing 400% of her portfolio value. Can you explain to this court what bank violates federal lending laws to give a low-level IT worker a $200,000 unsecured margin loan? Jamal blinked. The smooth veneer of the experienced broker cracked. He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. Well, he stammered, the regulations can sometimes be bypassed if the account holds specific volatile assets or if she engaged in options trading that resulted in an assignment. Judge Harrison leaned forward sharply. The wooden bench groaned under his weight. He pulled his reading glasses down his nose and glared at the witness. Mr. Jamal, I have overseen corporate bankruptcy cases for 2 decades. Do not attempt to patronize this court. Regulation T is a rigid federal statute. No regulated domestic brokerage firm allows a retail investor to maintain a margin loan at 400% of equity without triggering an immediate liquidation. Exactly, Your Honor, Ms. Kensington said. She turned back to Jamal. So either the bank committed a massive federal violation to accommodate an IT worker, or this document is fundamentally flawed. Let us move to the interest rate. She pointed to another line on the forged bank statement. You list the daily compounding interest rate here at 18%. Now, for a retail account, that is certainly high, but not impossible for a credit card. However, this is labeled as an institutional margin account. Standard margin rates currently hover between 8 and 10%. Why is an institutional margin account charging my client credit card interest rates? Jamal grabbed the glass of water in front of him. His hand was visibly trembling. Water sloshed over the rim and dripped onto the polished wood of the witness stand. I just compiled the numbers from the mail I found, he said, his voice losing its confident projection. I am not her broker. I do not set the rates. I just recorded what the statement said. You testified you performed an expert forensic audit, Ms. Kensington reminded him ruthlessly. You brought these documents to a federal judge to strip my client of her civil liberties. But the math on these papers contradicts fundamental banking reality. She walked back to our table and retrieved another document from her file. Let us look at the routing numbers you harvested. You claim these margin calls were issued by Vanguard Financial Partners. That happens to be your employer, correct? Jamal swallowed hard. His throat tightened visibly. Yes, but I had nothing to do with her accounts. It is a large firm. Ms. Kensington smiled. A very large firm. But a firm that strictly adheres to the Patriot Act and Know Your Customer regulations. If my client, an individual retail investor, opened a margin account at your firm, she would be classified under a retail tier. But look at the account classification code on the document you submitted. She handed a blown-up version of the document to the bailiff, who placed it on the overhead projector. A string of alphanumeric codes flashed onto the large screen facing the judge. Can you read that classification code for the court, Jamal? Miss Kensington commanded. Jamal stared at the screen. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He looked toward Mr. Caldwell in the gallery. Mr. Caldwell was staring intently at his legal pad, suddenly realizing his star witness was imploding. My parents exchanged panicked glances. They had no idea what was happening, but they recognized the scent of blood in the water. Read it, Ms. Kensington demanded again. It says CORP-7, Jamal muttered. Speak up, please, Judge Harrison instructed, his voice cold and unforgiving. CORP-7. Jamal repeated slightly louder. And what does CORP-7 designate in standard banking architecture? Ms. Kensington asked. Jamal gripped the edge of the witness box. His knuckles were white. It designates a corporate entity account, he whispered. Ms. Kensington turned to the judge. A corporate entity account, Your Honor. Not a retail account for an individual. Not a basic checking account for a help desk worker. A corporate entity. She turned back to Jamal, stepping so close to the witness box she invaded his personal space. Why does the document you submitted under oath to prove my client is an incompetent retail investor bear the internal classification code of a corporate holding company? I do not know, Jamal stammered. His charismatic shield was completely shattered. He was scrambling, looking for an exit that did not exist. It must be a clerical error by the bank, a printing mistake. I just found the papers in her condo. I did not generate the codes. Judge Harrison picked up the forged document from his desk and scrutinized it. There are no clerical errors of this magnitude in institutional finance, Mr. Jamal, the judge stated, his tone laced with absolute authority. An account carrying this much leverage classified under a corporate tier requires extensive corporate underwriting board resolutions and verified collateral. It requires a corporate tax identification number. It is mathematically and procedurally impossible for the respondent sitting at the defense table to hold this specific debt under these specific terms as an individual retail investor. Jamal looked like he was about to be physically sick. The trap had closed. He had forged the documents using my real dormant account number. But because he was an investment broker accustomed to dealing with corporate accounts, he had inadvertently used corporate financial templates to create his fake statements. He had layered highly complex corporate debt structures onto my personal information. To a layman like my parents, it looked like terrifying personal debt. To a seasoned corporate litigator and a federal judge, it looked like absolute nonsense. Miss Kensington walked back to our table. Her posture was relaxed, triumphant. Mr. Caldwell stood up, his chair scraping awkwardly. "Your Honor, my witness has testified that he simply compiled the documents he found. He is not responsible for the bank's internal coding errors." "Sit down, Mr. Caldwell," Judge Harrison snapped. The judge glared at Jamal. His eyes were narrowed, assessing the sweating, stuttering man in the witness box. "The court will determine the validity of these documents, but I will remind the witness that providing false testimony or submitting fabricated evidence to this court is a federal crime." Jamal shrank back into his chair. He was no longer the arrogant broker dictating my downfall. He was a terrified man desperately trying to plug the holes in a sinking ship, but the ship was already underwater. Ms. Kensington had completely dismantled his financial credibility, and she was just getting started. Mrs. Kensington walked back to our defense table. She moved with a terrifying calm, taking her time to select the next document from her perfectly organized file. The silence in the room stretched out, becoming heavy and suffocating. Jamal sat in the witness box, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple. He kept glancing toward my parents and Brittany, but they were frozen, staring at him with mounting panic. They had hitched their wagon to his supposed expertise, and the wheels were rapidly falling off. Ms. Kensington picked up a manila folder and turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, the defense would like to enter our first piece of counter-evidence into the record. I have provided copies for the bench and for opposing counsel." The bailiff took the folders, distributing them to Judge Harrison and Mr. Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell snatched his copy, opening it with frantic haste. I watched his eyes scan the page. The color drained from his face so fast he looked as though he might faint. He dropped the paper onto his desk, staring at it as if it were a live grenade. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses, reading the document, his brow furrowed, deepening the lines on his forehead. "Ms. Kensington, what exactly are we looking at here?" "This, Your Honor, is the state registration filing for a limited liability company called Apex Holdings Group, LLC EMS. Kensington explained, her voice carrying clearly across the room. I kept my eyes locked on Jamal. The moment Ms. Kensington said the name Apex Holdings Group, he physically recoiled. His shoulders hiked up to his ears and his mouth dropped open. It was the involuntary flinch of a man who just realized he had walked into a minefield. Ms. Kensington approached the witness box, handing a copy of the document directly to Jamal. "Mr. Jamal," she said softly, dangerously, "I would like you to read the contents of this public state registry filing for the court." Jamal stared at the paper in his trembling hands. "I do not see what this has to do with Cassidy's debt," he deflected, his voice cracking slightly. "I am here to testify about her personal financial ruin." "Oh, it has everything to do with it," Ms. Kensington replied, stepping back and folding her arms. "Because as you established earlier, those margin loans require a corporate entity. And as it turns out, Apex Holdings Group, LLC, is the exact corporate entity that holds the $400,000 in debt you just swore under oath belonged to my client." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Brittany let out a sharp, confused noise, clutching her pregnant belly. My father stood halfway up from his seat before slowly sinking back down. "Read the document," Jamal, Ms. Kensington commanded. "Who is listed as the primary registered agent for Apex Holdings Group, LLC?" Jamal opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at Mr. Caldwell, begging for an objection, but his lawyer was staring at the floor, refusing to make eye contact. Caldwell knew a sinking ship when he saw one. "Read it," Jamal Judge Harrison ordered, his voice cracking like a whip. "It lists Cassidy as the primary agent." Jamal whispered, his voice trembling so badly the paper shook in his hands. "Speak up," Ms. Kensington demanded. "It lists Cassidy," Jamal repeated louder. Ms. Kensington smiled. "It does indeed list Cassidy. It uses her name and her home address. But let us look a little closer at the digital footprint of this corporate filing. As an investment broker, you are aware that state business registrations now log the IP address of the device used to file the electronic paperwork, correct?" "Yes," Jamal choked out. Ms. Kensington gestured to the bottom of the page. "Could you read the IP address logged by the state registry on the date this LLC was formed?" Jamal stared at the numbers. He was hyperventilating now, taking short, shallow breaths. He wiped his face with a shaking hand. "I do not know what an IP address proves." "Read the numbers," Mr. Jamal Judge Harrison warned, leaning forward over the bench. Jamal read the string of numbers, his voice barely a rasp. "Thank you," Ms. Kensington said. She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we subpoenaed the Internet Service Provider records for that specific IP address. The documentation is on the second page of your folder." Judge Harrison turned the page. He traced his finger along the printed lines. Ms. Kensington continued. "Mr. Jamal, could you read the physical location and registered owner of the IP address used to create the shell company that holds the debt you are trying to pin on my client?" Jamal squeezed his eyes shut. He was cornered. There was no charm, no financial jargon, no arrogant smirk left to save him. He was a man staring into the abyss of his own making. He looked pathetic. The custom-tailored suit now looked like a costume he had stolen. The gold Rolex on his wrist suddenly seemed like a heavy shackle. He had walked into this courtroom expecting a coronation, and instead he was sitting in the ruins of his own life. "Read it!" Ms. Kensington pushed, her voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "It traces back to Vanguard Financial Partners," Jamal whispered. "To the downtown Chicago branch," Ms. Kensington clarified. "To the exact floor and departmental subnet where your brokerage desk is located. Is that correct?" Jamal looked around the room like a trapped animal. "I do not know how that happened. Anyone could have used the network. It is a large office." Ms. Kensington laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Anyone in your office decided to steal my client's mail, harvest her dormant routing numbers, set up a shadow LLC in her name, and then use it to take out $400,000 in highly leveraged margin loans. And then, miraculously, you, the brother-in-law who stands to inherit her paid-off condominium, just happened to stumble across the financial debris and bring it to federal court." I watched my parents in the gallery. My mother was covering her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with absolute horror. My father was staring at Jamal, his face flushed, dark red with rage. They had wanted to believe I was a failure so desperately that they trusted a snake. Now the snake was shedding its skin right in front of them. Brittany stood up, her chair scraping loudly. "Jamal, what is she talking about?" Brittany shrieked, her carefully crafted, fragile pregnant act completely forgotten. "Tell them she is lying." "Order," Judge Harrison bellowed, slamming his gavel. "Sit down, young lady, or I will have you removed from my courtroom." Brittany collapsed back into her seat, sobbing hysterically, grabbing at her husband's jacket, but Jamal would not look at her. He kept his eyes glued to the forged papers in his hands, the physical proof of his federal crimes. Ms. Kensington stepped right up to the edge of the witness box. "You used your professional access at Vanguard to bypass standard identity verification checks, did you not, Jamal? You used her real account numbers as a foundation to build a fraudulent corporate shell. And then you brought those forged documents into a federal court to commit perjury to steal her home." "Objection," Mr. Caldwell shouted, finally finding his voice and jumping to his feet. "Counsel is testifying and badgering the witness." Judge Harrison glared at the lawyer. "Overruled, Mr. Caldwell. Your witness brought these documents into my courtroom claiming them as fact. The defense has every right to dismantle them." Ms. Kensington did not even look at Caldwell. She kept her eyes locked on Jamal. You thought because she worked in IT, she would not understand the financial architecture of what you did. You thought because her parents despised her, they would gladly help you lock her away. You thought you were the smartest man in the room. Jamal was sweating profusely now, dark patches forming under the arms of his expensive suit. He looked at the judge, his eyes pleading. "Your Honor, I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination." The words hung in the air, a devastating admission of guilt. He had just invoked his right to avoid confessing to a felony on the stand. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of absolute disgust. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. The court realized the depth of the fraud. Jamal had not just lied, he had orchestrated a complex financial crime and attempted to use the federal judicial system as his personal weapon. "My mother." Patricia shot out of her seat in the gallery. She looked frantic, the perfect veneer of the weeping concerned parent completely dissolving. "This is ridiculous," Patricia screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Ms. Kensington. "She is twisting everything. She's trying to confuse the court with all this technical nonsense to hide the fact that Cassidy is a failure." Beside her, my father Richard stood up, his face purple with outrage. "You can't let her do this," he bellowed, directing his fury at the judge. "Jamal is a professional. He was only trying to help us save our daughter. This lawyer is manipulating the evidence." The eruption shattered the decorum of the federal courtroom. Brittany, sensing the collapse of their plan, started sobbing loudly, clutching her stomach and crying out that the stress was harming her baby. The synchronized performance was chaotic, desperate, and entirely transparent. They were trying to drown out the facts with sheer volume. Judge Harrison's face darkened with a terrifying anger. He grabbed his heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. "Order in this court!" Judge Harrison roared, his voice booming over the commotion. "Sit down immediately, or I will hold every single one of you in contempt and have you escorted to holding cells." The threat of jail time acted like ice water. Patricia froze, her mouth still open. Richard grabbed her arm and pulled her back down into the wooden bench. Brittany choked off her fake sobs, looking terrified. The silence that fell over the room was absolute, heavy with the weight of the judge's fury. Judge Harrison leaned forward, fixing my parents with a glare that could melt steel. "This is a federal courtroom, not your living room. You do not interrupt these proceedings. You do not shout at counsel. And you absolutely do not attempt to dictate how I evaluate evidence. Is that understood?" My parents nodded weakly, thoroughly cowed. Judge Harrison turned his attention back to the witness box. Jamal looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. His breathing was shallow, his eyes darting frantically toward Mr. Caldwell, who was pointedly looking away, actively trying to distance himself from the disaster. "Now, Mr. Jamal," Judge Harrison said, his tone ominously calm, "I suggest you pay very close attention to my next question because your freedom likely depends on your answer. You are under oath." Jamal swallowed hard, nodding mutely. "Counsel has presented compelling evidence suggesting that you used your position at Vanguard Financial Partners to create a shell corporation, Apex Holdings Group LLC, utilizing an IP address registered to your firm," Judge Harrison stated, laying out the facts with surgical precision. "Furthermore, the evidence suggests you used this shell corporation to generate the debt you are now attempting to attribute to the respondent." The judge paused, letting the severity of the situation sink in. "Explain to this court right now why you used the respondent's dormant account numbers and personal information to open lines of credit without her consent." Jamal gripped the edge of the witness box. He looked desperately at Mr. Caldwell again. I want my lawyer. I need counsel." "Mr. Caldwell is counsel for the petitioners, not for you personally," Judge Harrison reminded him coldly. "You brought this evidence into my courtroom. You testified to its authenticity. Answer the question, or I will have you remanded into federal custody immediately for perjury and obstruction." Jamal squeezed his eyes shut. He was trapped. The arrogant, slick investment broker had been reduced to a trembling, sweating mess. I didn't mean for it to go this far," he stammered, his voice breaking. "Patricia and Richard, they said she was struggling. They said she needed help." Do not attempt to shift the blame to the gallery, Mr. Jamal, Judge Harrison warned. Your mother-in-law did not forge these documents using a Vanguard IP address. You did. Ms. Kensington stepped back in, sensing the blood in the water. Your Honor, the witness is stalling because there is no legitimate explanation. He harvested my client's mail during a family dinner, stole her routing numbers, and built this fraudulent structure specifically to force this conservatorship. The motive is clear. They want my client's paid-off condominium, and they were willing to commit federal fraud to get it. Mr. Caldwell finally stood up, though he looked physically ill. Your Honor, my clients had no knowledge of any fraudulent activity regarding these documents. If Mr. Jamal acted improperly, he did so independently. It was a stunning betrayal. Caldwell was throwing Jamal directly under the bus to save my parents and himself from the fallout. Jamal stared at the lawyer in disbelief, realizing he had just been cut loose by the very people who had encouraged him. Brittany shrieked from the gallery, completely abandoning her fragile act. You can't do this! Jamal was just trying to get us the house. They promised it to us. The entire courtroom froze. Brittany had just screamed a full confession into the open air. In her panic over her husband being abandoned by their lawyer, she had accidentally blurted out the entire conspiracy. They promised it to us. My parents looked at Brittany with absolute horror. Patricia buried her face in her hands. Richard looked like he was going to be sick. Ms. Kensington didn't even smile. She just looked at Judge Harrison and raised one eyebrow. The truth was out ugly and undeniable, delivered by the golden child herself. The predators had completely cannibalized each other. The echo of my sister's screech hung in the stale courtroom air like a toxic cloud. They promised it to us. 6 words that completely dismantled the elaborate performance my family had spent months choreographing. I watched my mother bury her face in her trembling hands. My father looked physically sick, his complexion turning a dangerous shade of gray. Brittany stood frozen, her hands hovering over her stomach, realizing too late that her outburst had just handed the court the exact motive for their massive financial fraud. Mr. Caldwell. My parents' high-priced attorney looked as though he had been struck by lightning. He was a man accustomed to controlling the narrative, to twisting facts until they fit his tailored legal strategies. Now his own client had just shouted a confession to conspiracy in front of a federal judge. He slowly sank back into his chair, dragging a hand down his face. The polished professional veneer was gone, replaced by the hollow stare of a man calculating how quickly he could distance himself from the impending disaster. Judge Harrison did not say a word. He simply stared at the gallery, letting the sheer weight of Brittany's confession settle over the room. The silence was absolute. The court reporter stopped typing. The bailiff stood perfectly still. The only sound was the jagged, panicked breathing coming from Jamal, who was still trapped in the witness box. This was the moment we had been waiting for. The foundation of their lies had collapsed. Now it was time to drop the payload. Ms. Kensington turned away from the disastrous scene in the gallery and walked calmly back to our defense table. She reached down and unclasped her premium leather briefcase. She did not rush. Every movement was deliberate, calculated to draw the attention of every single person in the room. When she stood back up, she was holding a thick, heavy black folder. It was not a standard legal file. It was bound in heavy cardstock and secured with a tamper-evident red seal. The emblem of the United States government was faintly visible through the heavy plastic casing protecting it. I sat perfectly still watching her. This folder contained my entire hidden life. It contained the absolute truth of who I was, what I had built, and exactly how powerful I had become, while my family treated me like a useless burden. Ms. Kensington walked toward the bench, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. The sound was like a metronome counting down the final seconds of my family's freedom. Your Honor, Ms. Kensington said, her voice ringing with absolute authority. The defense would like to submit our final exhibit into the official court record. This folder contains certified, highly classified financial documents procured directly from the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Reserve Board. The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Reserve. These were not agencies that concerned themselves with low-level IT workers or minor credit card debt. These were the titans of institutional finance, the regulatory bodies that governed Wall Street and global markets. Jamal gasped audibly from the witness stand. His eyes bugged out of his head. As a licensed investment broker, he knew exactly what those names meant. He knew the SEC did not issue sealed documents for retail banking errors. He realized in that agonizing moment that he had kicked a sleeping dragon and the dragon had just woken up. Mr. Caldwell leaped out of his chair so fast it tipped backward and crashed onto the floor. "Objection!" he shouted, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a gross violation of procedure. The defense cannot introduce sealed federal documents at the 11th hour. We have had no time for discovery. We have not reviewed these materials. This is an ambush. I demand these documents be struck from the record immediately." Caldwell was sweating profusely. He was terrified. He had walked into this courtroom believing he was facilitating a simple conservatorship over a mentally unstable woman. Now he was staring down the barrel of a federal financial investigation, and his fingerprints were all over the forged documents that initiated it. He needed to stop the judge from opening that folder to save his own legal license. Ms. Kensington did not even look at him. She kept her eyes locked on Judge Harrison. "Your Honor," opposing counsel filed an emergency injunction this morning demanding the immediate seizure of my client's assets without prior notice. Under federal rules of civil procedure, an emergency filing waives the standard discovery period for responsive evidence. They demanded an immediate ruling based on their evidence. We are simply providing the court with the actual verified truth to prevent a gross miscarriage of justice. Judge Harrison glared at Caldwell. "The defense is correct, Mr. Caldwell. You cannot weaponize the emergency injunction process to bypass discovery and then cry foul when opposing counsel brings receipts. You opened this door. Now you are going to walk through it." Objection overruled. Caldwell deflated, collapsing back against the plaintiff's table. He looked at my parents with pure venom. They had lied to him. They had assured him this would be an easy case. Now he was an accessory to federal fraud. Ms. Kensington stepped up to the bench and handed the heavy black folder directly to the judge. "The documents inside have been certified and sealed by federal regulators, Your Honor," she explained, her voice steady and respectful. "They outline the true nature of my client's financial holdings, her professional capacity, and the exact origin of the corporate shell company Mr. Jamal utilized for his forgeries." Judge Harrison took the folder. The courtroom held its collective breath. My parents leaned forward in the gallery, their faces pale and strained. Brittany was gripping the wooden bench so hard her knuckles were stark white. Jamal was completely paralyzed, trapped in the witness box, staring at the black folder like it was an explosive device. The judge picked up a heavy brass letter opener from his desk. He slid the blade under the tamper-evident red seal. The sharp tearing sound of the thick paper being cut echoed loudly in the dead silence of the room. It was the sound of a world shifting, of a 34-year-old lie finally being ripped apart. Judge Harrison opened the folder. He adjusted his glasses and began to read the top page. I watched his face intently. For the first few seconds, his expression remained impassive, a mask of judicial neutrality. Then his eyes widened slightly. He flipped to the second page, his brow furrowing deeply. He read faster, scanning the dense paragraphs of federal financial disclosures and corporate registration details. The color slowly drained from his face. He looked up from the documents and stared directly at me. It was not a look of pity or confusion. It was a look of profound, absolute shock. He had spent the last 2 hours listening to a narrative about a pathetic, incompetent woman drowning in debt. Now he was looking at the certified truth of a corporate titan. He looked back down at the folder, turning to the third page. This page contained the forensic tracking of Jamal's IP address and the internal financial audits of Vanguard Financial Partners. As Judge Harrison read the final paragraphs detailing the exact nature of the wire fraud, his skin flushed a deep, angry red. The veins in his neck stood out. The realization of what had almost happened in his courtroom, the sheer brazen criminality of the family sitting before him, hit him with full force. The silence in the room was absolute, waiting for the hammer to fall. It fell with the force of a thunderclap. Judge Harrison slammed his wooden gavel down against the sounding block with such explosive violence that several people in the gallery physically jumped. The sharp crack echoed off the high ceiling, cutting through the suffocating tension like a physical blow. "Stop immediately!" Judge Harrison roared, his voice trembling with a terrifying blend of absolute authority and sheer outrage. "Bailiff, lock those doors. No one leaves this courtroom. Call security." Chaos erupted instantly. My mother, Patricia, let out a piercing theatrical scream. She grabbed my father's arm, her face contorted with panic. "Oh my God, Richard!" she wailed, her voice cutting through the sudden uproar. "They are arresting her. I told you she was unstable. I told you she needed to be locked away." She actually believed the order was meant for me. She was so consumed by her own fabricated narrative, so certain of her own impending victory, that she could not comprehend the reality unfolding right in front of her. She thought the judge had seen my financial records and determined I was a criminal. She thought she was about to get everything she wanted. I did not move. I sat perfectly still beside Miss Kensington, watching the spectacle unfold. Two armed court bailiffs immediately moved to the heavy wooden double doors at the back of the room, securing the latches with loud metallic clicks. A third bailiff, a burly man with a stern expression, moved swiftly down the center aisle, positioning himself directly behind the witness box. Silence. Judge Harrison bellowed, slamming the gavel a second time. The noise in the gallery died instantly, replaced by a tense, terrified quiet. The judge stood up, his black robes billowing around him. He pointed a trembling finger, not at me, not at the defense table, but directly at Jamal, who was still sitting in the witness chair. "Mr. Jamal," Judge Harrison said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, "I am ordering you to remain exactly where you are. If you attempt to stand up or leave that box, you will be physically restrained." Jamal froze. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The arrogant swagger, the expensive suit, the gold Rolex, none of it mattered anymore. He was a man cornered by his own hubris. Brittany, sitting in the gallery, let out a confused, choked sob. "Jamal, what is happening?" she cried out, her voice high and thin. "Why is he looking at you like that?" Mr. Caldwell, the plaintiff's attorney, was already scrambling backward away from his own table. He looked as though he was trying to physically distance himself from the toxic fallout that was about to rain down. He stared at the black folder sitting on the judge's desk, realizing with horrifying clarity that he had been an unwitting pawn in a massive federal crime. "Your Honor," Mr. Caldwell stammered, his voice shaking, "I must state for the record that I had absolutely no prior knowledge of the contents of those documents. I relied entirely on the sworn testimony of the witness." Judge Harrison did not even look at him. His eyes remained locked on Jamal, burning with a cold, righteous fury. "This court has just been handed certified sealed documents directly from the Securities and Exchange Commission." Judge Harrison announced, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "These documents detail an ongoing federal investigation into severe financial misconduct. An investigation that directly implicates the man sitting in my witness box." A collective gasp swept through the gallery. My father, Richard, stared at the judge, his jaw slack with disbelief. My mother stopped crying, her fake tears forgotten as genuine panic set in. They had brought Jamal here to steal my condo, and instead they had walked him right into a federal trap. "Mr. Jamal," the judge continued, "you sat in my courtroom today and swore under oath that you discovered a mountain of highly leveraged corporate debt belonging to the respondent. You presented bank statements and default notices that you claimed were evidence of her financial incompetence." Jamal swallowed hard, a visible lump bobbing in his throat. He looked desperately toward Mr. Caldwell, but his lawyer was staring at the floor, refusing to make eye contact. "What you failed to mention," Judge Harrison said, his voice rising in volume with every word, "is that the corporate shell company holding this debt, Apex Holdings Group, LLC, is currently the subject of a massive federal fraud investigation. Brittany let out another sob, burying her face in her hands. She knew exactly what Apex Holdings Group was. It was the name on the forged documents she had helped orchestrate. She knew they were caught. And what is even more disturbing, the judge continued, holding up the thick stack of papers from the black folder, is the origin of that shell company. According to these certified SEC records, Apex Holdings Group, LLC, was not created by the respondent. It was created using an IP address registered to Vanguard Financial Partners. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Specifically, Judge Harrison enunciated every syllable it was created using the internal terminal assigned to you, Mr. Jamal. You used your professional access as a licensed investment broker to forge a corporate entity in your sister-in-law's name. You then used her stolen personal information to fraudulently acquire over $400,000 in unsecured margin loans. I watched my parents. The realization hit them like a physical blow. Their golden son-in-law, the man they had praised for his financial acumen, the man they had trusted to help them steal my home, was a criminal. He had not just lied about me. He had used my name to commit a massive federal crime, and he had dragged them all into the crossfire. But you did not stop there, did you, Mr. Jamal? The judge pressed, his voice echoing with disgust. You thought you could use this court to legitimize your fraud. You thought you could submit these forged documents under oath, declare the respondent incompetent, and have your in-laws seize her assets to cover your tracks. You attempted to use the federal judicial system as an instrument of theft. Jamal finally found his voice, though it was barely a squeak. I did not. I was just trying to. Do not speak, Judge Harrison thundered. You have already said enough today to guarantee a very long stay in federal prison. The judge turned to the bailiff standing behind the witness box. Officer, place him in custody. The bailiff stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. Jamal did not resist. He simply slumped forward, resting his forehead against the wooden railing as the cold metal snapped around his wrists. The sharp metallic click echoed through the silent courtroom, a definitive end to his arrogant charade. Brittany shrieked a raw, agonizing sound that tore through the quiet room. She jumped up from the gallery, reaching out toward her husband. Jamal, she screamed. No, you cannot take him. He did not do anything wrong. He was just trying to get us the house. Her desperate confession hung in the air, confirming everything the judge had just said. She had known about the plan. She had been a willing participant in the attempted theft. My parents sat frozen, watching their perfect world collapse into ruin. The daughter they had tried to destroy was sitting quietly at the defense table, untouched and unbothered. The son-in-law they had worshipped was being hauled away in handcuffs. The narrative they had built their lives around was completely shattered. Judge Harrison looked down at the documents one last time before turning his gaze back to the gallery. The fury in his eyes was unyielding. The show was over, but the consequences were just beginning. Judge Harrison opened the black folder, his expression grave. He looked from the documents to the gallery and then directly at Jamal, who sat frozen in the witness box. The silence was absolute, a heavy, expectant quiet that filled the courtroom. The court will now hear the contents of the sealed documents provided by the defense, Judge Harrison announced, his voice echoing in the stillness. These documents, certified by the Securities and Exchange Commission, detail the financial holdings and professional standing of the respondent Cassidy. He paused, adjusting his reading glasses. According to these records, Cassidy is the founder, chief executive officer, and majority shareholder of Aegis Financial Security. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. The name Aegis Financial Security was not unknown. It was a prominent firm frequently mentioned in financial news. Aegis Financial Security is recognized as a top-tier cybersecurity and financial technology firm. Judge Harrison continued reading from the document. The company provides critical security infrastructure for numerous Fortune 500 corporations and several international banks. He looked up from the page, his gaze locking onto my parents. The respondent is not, as previously testified by the plaintiffs, a low-level IT help desk worker. The color drained completely from my mother's face. My father looked as though he had been struck. Brittany, sitting beside her parents, physically recoiled, her hand flying to her mouth. Jamal, the supposed financial expert, stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer terror. Furthermore, Judge Harrison said, his voice rising slightly, the SEC documents verify the respondent's personal net worth. As the primary shareholder of Aegis Financial Security, Cassidy's verified net worth is in excess of $85 million. The courtroom erupted into whispers. The number hung in the air, impossible for my family to comprehend. $85 million. The downtown condominium and the vehicle in question, the judge added, his tone laced with disdain, represent less than a fraction of a percent of her total assets. The assertion that she is drowning in $400,000 of debt is not only false, it is absurd. My parents sat paralyzed, the reality of my success crashing down around them. They had spent years belittling me, calling me a failure, and telling everyone I was a disappointment. They had tried to strip me of my independence, believing I was nothing more than a struggling IT worker they could easily control. Brittany, who had just moments before been dreaming of moving into my condo, looked like she might be sick. The realization that the sister she had mocked and underestimated was a multimillionaire CEO was clearly too much for her to process. The documentation also details the origin of the debt attributed to the respondent. Judge Harrison said, his voice hardening as he turned back to the papers. The $400,000 in highly leveraged margin loans was not generated by Cassidy. It was, as the defense has demonstrated, held by a shell corporation. He looked directly at Jamal, who was sweating profusely, his face pale and drawn. This shell corporation, Apex Holdings Group, LLC, was created using an IP address registered to Vanguard Financial Partners. The judge stated, reading from the SEC report. Specifically, the IP address traces back to the terminal assigned to you, Mr. Jamal. Jamal closed his eyes, his head dropping forward. The arrogant broker was gone, replaced by a broken, desperate man. The SEC investigation, Judge Harrison continued, his voice ringing with absolute authority, reveals that Apex Holdings Group, LLC, is the subject of an ongoing federal inquiry. The investigation focuses on fraudulent activity, specifically the unauthorized use of personal information to secure margin loans. The judge paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the courtroom. In other words, Mr. Jamal, you used the respondent's stolen personal information to create a fraudulent entity and then used that entity to illegally acquire $400,000. The silence returned, heavier this time, suffocating. My family sat frozen, the truth laid bare before them. Their golden son-in-law, the man they had trusted to help them steal my home, was a federal criminal. You brought these forged documents into this courtroom, Judge Harrison said, his fury palpable. You swore under oath that they were genuine. You attempted to use the federal judicial system to legitimize your fraud. He looked at my parents, who were staring at Jamal in horror. And you, Patricia and Richard, you stood before this court and lied. You fabricated a story about your daughter's mental health to facilitate this theft. Your Honor, please, my mother cried out, her voice trembling. We didn't know about the fraud. We just wanted to help her. You wanted her property, Judge Harrison retorted, his voice cold and unforgiving. You were willing to destroy her life to get it. This court has zero tolerance for such malicious deception. He turned to the bailiffs. The doors remain locked. No one leaves. The tension in the room was unbearable. My family had played a dangerous game, and they had lost everything. They had sought to break me, but in doing so, they had shattered their own lives. Ms. Kensington leaned toward me, her voice a low murmur. The final act is about to begin. I nodded, feeling a cold, calm certainty. The truth was out. The lies were exposed. Now it was time for consequences. Judge Harrison turned his attention from my parents back to the witness box. The fury in his eyes had settled into a cold and clinical executioner's stare. He picked up the stack of forged bank statements Jamal had provided earlier and held them up for the entire room to see. Mr. Jamal, let us return to the financial exhibits you so helpfully provided to this court today. The judge began, his voice echoing loudly. You sat in that chair and swore under penalty of perjury that these documents were accurate representations of the respondent's liabilities. You claimed she was hiding massive financial delinquency. Jamal gripped the wooden railing of the witness box so hard his knuckles looked like they might burst through his skin. He was panting short, shallow breaths of a man who realized the walls were rapidly closing in. What the Securities and Exchange Commission found, however, is that these documents are indeed accurate records of financial maneuvering. Judge Harrison continued, they perfectly document the flow of hundreds of thousands of dollars. The math is incredibly precise. There is only one problem. This money does not belong to Cassidy. And these margin loans were not taken out to fund a luxury lifestyle. The judge looked down at the sealed SEC file, reading directly from the highlighted text. Apex Holdings Group, LLC, was not just a dummy corporation created to forge a few late notices. According to federal investigators, it is an active operational shadow account, an account that has been receiving unauthorized wire transfers from several high-net-worth portfolios managed by Vanguard Financial Partners. The courtroom atmosphere shifted from shocked silence to absolute electric tension. My father let out a strangled gasp. Brittany stopped crying and stared at her husband with her mouth hanging open. Ms. Kensington stepped out from behind our defense table and walked toward the center of the room. Your Honor, if I may clarify for the record, she said, her tone razor-sharp. Proceed. Judge Harrison granted. Ms. Kensington turned to face the gallery, making sure my family heard every single word. Mr. Jamal is an investment broker. He manages millions of dollars for wealthy clients. For the past 14 months, he has been systematically skimming fractions of percentages off the top of his clients' portfolios. He was siphoning client funds and hiding the stolen money in a corporate shell entity. That entity is Apex Holdings Group, LLC. Jamal shook his head frantically. No, he whispered, his voice cracking. No, that is not what happened. You do not get to speak, Ms. Kensington snapped, shutting him down instantly. You waived your right to control this narrative the moment you committed federal perjury. She turned back to the judge. The brilliance of Mr. Jamal's embezzlement scheme was his choice of registered agent. He knew that if Vanguard or the SEC ever audited the shadow account, he needed a scapegoat, someone he could easily frame. So he stole his sister-in-law's mail. He harvested her dormant routing numbers and her personal information. He registered Apex Holdings Group under Cassidy's name. He was setting her up to take the fall for his federal wire fraud long before this family dispute over a condominium ever began. My mother let out a sharp, horrifying wail. She looked at Jamal as if he had just turned into a monster right in front of her. He had not just tried to steal my house. He had been planning to frame me for his own massive corporate theft and send me to federal prison in his place. But then the family dynamic presented an unexpected opportunity. Ms. Kensington continued pacing slowly in front of the witness box. My client's parents wanted to seize her real estate. They needed to prove she was financially incompetent. Mr. Jamal realized he could kill two birds with one stone. He could help his wife steal a luxury downtown condo, and he could permanently silence the scapegoat he had set up for his embezzlement. After all, if Cassidy was declared legally incompetent and locked in a psychological facility under a conservatorship, she would never be able to defend herself when the SEC eventually found the stolen money. It was a masterclass in sociopathic planning. He would get my house, he would get my money, and I would get locked away taking the blame for his financial crimes. It was flawless, except for one fatal error born of pure arrogance. Mr. Jamal was lazy, Ms. Kensington stated, pointing directly at him. When he needed to create forged debt to present to this court today, he did not bother to create a new fake company. He simply printed out the actual ledgers from his embezzlement shell company. He took the exact amounts he had stolen from Vanguard clients, slapped a forged margin loan header on them, and brought them to a federal judge. Judge Harrison leaned over the bench, staring down at Jamal with absolute disgust. By submitting these financial documents to this court to steal the respondent's condominium, you accidentally submitted the written signed proof of your own wire fraud. You handed a federal judge the exact ledger of your embezzlement, and you swore under oath that the numbers were accurate. The sheer magnitude of the mistake hung heavily in the air. Jamal had walked into a federal courthouse trying to steal my property and had literally handed the judge a signed confession to his own multi-million-dollar corporate theft. He had wrapped his own federal indictment in a neat little bow and presented it as evidence. I did not know. Jamal sobbed, his voice breaking completely. I did not know she was a CEO. I thought she was just an IT worker. I thought no one would look that closely. He finally confessed. He admitted he targeted me because he thought I was poor, uneducated, and defenseless. He thought I was exactly the failure my parents had always claimed I was. "You thought wrong, Mr. Jamal," Judge Harrison stated, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "You assumed the respondent was weak. You assumed this court was blind. You assumed you could use the justice system as your personal weapon. You have made a catastrophic miscalculation." Brittany stood up from the gallery, her face flushed red with a terrifying mix of betrayal and rage. She pointed a shaking finger at her husband. "You told me we were getting the condo," she shrieked, ignoring all courtroom decorum. "You told me you fixed the numbers. You never said you were stealing from your clients. You told me we were going to be rich." Her selfishness was breathtaking. Even now, even after learning her husband had set her own sister up to take the fall for federal wire fraud, her only concern was that the money was not real and the condo was not hers. She was furious that her ticket to a luxury lifestyle was actually a one-way ticket to federal prison. "Mr. Caldwell?" The attorney who had championed their cause shoved his chair back from the plaintiff's table. He looked absolutely terrified. He gathered his legal pads and shoved them into his briefcase with frantic, jerky movements. He wanted nothing to do with the radioactive fallout of this case. "Your Honor," Caldwell stammered, refusing to look at my parents or Jamal. "As an officer of the court, I was completely unaware of this criminal activity. I formally request to withdraw as counsel for the petitioners effective immediately. I cannot represent clients engaged in active federal fraud." Judge Harrison slammed his gavel down, confirming the withdrawal. "Request granted, Mr. Caldwell. You are dismissed." My parents were left completely alone at the plaintiff's table. They had no lawyer. They had no golden son-in-law. They had no case. They had walked in as proud, arrogant predators, and now they were nothing more than undefended co-conspirators in a massive federal crime. The trap had closed entirely, and there was no way out. Judge Harrison did not hesitate for another second. He gave a sharp, definitive nod to the armed bailiffs stationed around the room. "Move in," the judge commanded, his voice cutting through the heavy, suffocating air of the courtroom. "Place the witness under arrest." The two bailiffs advanced immediately, closing the distance to the witness box with heavy, purposeful strides. Jamal shrank back into the wooden chair, throwing his hands up in a pathetic, defensive gesture, but there was nowhere left to run. The larger of the two officers grabbed Jamal's arm, hauling him roughly to his feet. His expensive tailored jacket bunched up awkwardly around his shoulders as he was manhandled out of his seat. "Jamal, you have the right to remain silent," the bailiff barked, reciting the Miranda rights as he forcefully twisted the broker's arms behind his back. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The metallic snap of the handcuffs echoing across the room sounded like absolute music to my ears. It was the heavy, definitive sound of justice finally being served. The golden boy of my toxic family, the untouchable investment broker who thought he could steal my life, was now standing in front of a federal judge with his wrists chained together. "You are being placed under arrest for federal wire fraud, forgery, and perjury under oath," the bailiff announced, loud enough for every single person in the gallery to hear clearly. Brittany completely lost whatever fragile grip she still had on her sanity. She scrambled out of her seat on the gallery bench, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. She lunged forward toward the wooden partition separating the gallery from the court well, screaming hysterically. "No, you cannot take him!" Brittany shrieked, her voice cracking as she reached her arms out frantically toward her husband. "Jamal, tell them to stop. Tell them you have the money. We need that condo. What about my baby? What about our house? She was not crying because her husband was a criminal. She was wailing because her luxury lifestyle had just evaporated before her eyes. The perfect successful partner she loved to parade in front of me was exposed as a desperate broke fraudster who embezzled from his own clients. He had used her boundless greed to facilitate his crimes, and now she was left with absolutely nothing. A third bailiff stepped directly into Brittany's path, holding up a massive hand to block her from reaching the defendant. "Step back, ma'am," the officer warned sternly. "Interfere with this arrest and you will be placed in cuffs right beside him." My parents sat frozen in their seats, watching the horrific spectacle unfold. Patricia clamped her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock as the bailiffs dragged Jamal out of the witness box. Richard looked completely hollowed out, staring at the floor as his entire fabricated reality collapsed into a pathetic criminal disgrace. The illusion of their perfect family was dead, and I had been the one to finally destroy it completely. As the heavy wooden doors swung shut behind the bailiffs, the reality hit the plaintiff's table like a physical shockwave. Mr. Caldwell, the attorney who strutted into this courtroom demanding my life be handed over to his clients, moved with panicked energy. He grabbed his fountain pen and shoved it into his briefcase. He swept the forged summaries off the table to get them out of sight. He was certainly not about to go down with their sinking ship. "Your Honor," Mr. Caldwell announced, his voice laced with defensive anger. He snapped his briefcase shut. "I must formally and urgently address the court." Judge Harrison focused his piercing gaze on the attorney. "Proceed," Mr. Caldwell, the judge commanded, devoid of professional courtesy. "Let the record show I was retained to file a standard conservatorship petition," Caldwell stated loudly. "I was provided with financial documents my clients represented as entirely authentic. I had no knowledge these exhibits were forged or of any corporate embezzlement." My parents stared at their lawyer in absolute shock. Richard opened his mouth to protest, but Caldwell held up a hand, silencing him instantly. The attorney was cutting ties to their fraudulent enterprise with brutal precision. Given the shocking revelations, Caldwell continued, "I cannot in good conscience represent these petitioners. The foundation of our filing has been revealed as a criminal fabrication. I formally request to withdraw as counsel for Patricia and Richard. I will not be party to a malicious fraud." The silence that followed his declaration was deafening. Patricia looked as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. The legal shield she had hidden behind had just publicly labeled her a fraud. Judge Harrison did not hesitate. "Your request is granted, Mr. Caldwell," the judge declared with finality. "You are dismissed. I suggest you retain all communications with your former clients. The federal investigators looking into Mr. Jamal's embezzlement ring will likely want to review exactly how these forged documents made their way into my courtroom." "Understood, Your Honor," Caldwell replied stiffly. He grabbed his briefcase, turned on his heel, and marched down the center aisle. He did not spare a single glance for my parents or my sister. He practically ran out of the heavy wooden doors, leaving them completely undefended. The power dynamic in the room had entirely inverted. Patricia and Richard sat alone at the plaintiff's table. There was no slick lawyer to speak for them. There was no golden son-in-law to provide fake financial expertise. There was just an empty table, a stack of lies, and a furious federal judge. "Your Honor, my father," Richard stammered, standing up on shaky legs. "Please, you have to understand. We did not know Jamal was stealing. We just thought Cassidy needed help. We love her." "Sit down!" Judge Harrison roared the command, hitting the room like a physical strike. "Do not insult the intelligence of this court by invoking parental love." Richard collapsed back into his chair. Patricia covered her face, sobbing real ugly tears of terror. "I have presided over this bench for 2 decades, Judge Harrison said, his voice vibrating with a cold, righteous anger. "I have seen bitter divorces, corporate espionage, and vicious family disputes. But I have rarely witnessed a display of greed as callous and calculated as the one you attempted to execute in my courtroom today." The judge leaned forward, pointing a finger directly at my parents. "You walked in here and painted a picture of a mentally unstable, incompetent woman. You tried to use the crushing weight of the legal system to strip your own daughter of her autonomy, her property, and her basic human rights. And for what? So your other daughter could have a free downtown condominium, so you could pat yourselves on the back for sweeping an independent, successful woman under the rug. My mother whimpered, shaking her head, but she could not look away from the judge. You allowed your son-in-law to present forged documents to a federal court. Judge Harrison continued, his disgust palpable. You corroborated his lies. You testified under oath that the respondent was suffering a psychotic break when she was simply exhausted from running a multi-million-dollar technology firm. You weaponized her hard work against her. You tried to cage a brilliant, successful woman because she did not fit the pathetic, subservient narrative you created for her. I sat next to Ms. Kensington, watching my parents shrink under the absolute devastation of the judge's reprimand. They had spent 34 years making me feel small, making me feel like an insignificant failure. Now a federal judge was systematically destroying their entire identity in front of a public gallery. The respondent did not need your help, Judge Harrison stated firmly. She needed protection from you. You are complicit in a malicious fraud against your own flesh and blood. You are incredibly fortunate that the federal prosecutors are currently focused on Mr. Jamal's wire fraud. If it were entirely up to me, you would be leaving this courtroom in handcuffs right alongside him. My father buried his face in his hands, trembling visibly. The sheer humiliation of being dressed down by a federal judge, of being exposed as a greedy fraudster, had broken his pride completely. Let this be a warning to both of you. Judge Harrison finalized, his tone absolute. If you ever attempt to use this court or any other legal avenue to harass, manipulate, or extort the respondent again, the consequences will be immediate and catastrophic. This petition for conservatorship is dismissed with extreme prejudice. The judge slammed his gavel down one last time, dismissing the case permanently. The sharp crack echoed through the room, sealing my victory. My parents were left sitting at their empty table, stripped of their dignity, their legal counsel, and their illusions of superiority. They were completely defenseless. Their grand conspiracy had shattered, leaving nothing behind but the crushing weight of their own undeniable guilt. Court is adjourned, Judge Harrison announced, standing up and sweeping out of the room through his private chambers. The remaining bailiffs began clearing the gallery, ushering out the few lingering spectators who had stayed to watch the spectacular implosion of my family. Ms. Kensington snapped her premium leather briefcase shut, with quiet efficiency. She gave me a brief nod, indicating that our work here was finished. But I was not quite ready to leave. I turned and walked slowly across the center aisle toward the plaintiff's table. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor, echoing in the rapidly emptying courtroom. My parents and my sister were still huddled around the empty table, looking like survivors of a shipwreck. They had nowhere to go, and no one left to manipulate. As I approached, my mother lifted her head. Her face was streaked with mascara, and her perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess. The absolute terror in her eyes shifted into a desperate, pathetic kind of hope when she saw me standing there. She completely forgot the horrible things she had sworn under oath just an hour ago. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Cassidy, please. Patricia begged, her voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. She reached her trembling hands out across the table, trying to grab my arm. I took a deliberate step back, just out of her reach. You have to help us, she pleaded. You heard the judge. He said you have $85 million. You have more money than we could ever imagine. My father looked up, his expression a mix of shame and desperate agreement. Brittany stood up from the gallery bench, wiping her face. Cassidy, you have to bail Jamal out, Brittany sobbed, stepping toward the partition. He is going to federal prison. You have to hire him a defense lawyer. You have the money to fix this and save the family reputation. I looked at the three of them. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel anger anymore. I just felt an overwhelming, absolute coldness. They had just tried to strip me of my human rights, lock me in a psychological facility, and steal my home. Now, because their plan had backfired and sent their golden boy to jail, they expected me to open my checkbook and save them from the consequences. I looked down at them with absolute ice. I let the silence stretch, ensuring they felt the full crushing weight of my gaze. I am just an irresponsible IT worker, remember? I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. I live in a fantasy world. I am mentally unfit to manage my own life. I could not possibly know how to manage a massive federal criminal crisis like this. Patricia gasped, clutching her chest, as if I had physically struck her. But we are your family, she wailed, the desperation spilling over. You cannot just leave us like this. I stared right into my mother's weeping eyes. I did not leave you, I corrected her coldly. You abandoned me 34 years ago. Today is just the day I finally stopped pretending otherwise. Brittany stumbled forward, hitting the wooden gate that separated the gallery from the defense table. She was hyperventilating, mascara running down her cheeks in dark, jagged lines. She completely ignored my response to our mother and focused solely on her own immediate greed. But what about the condo? Brittany pleaded, her voice shrill and desperate. You do not even need it, Cassidy. You are a multimillionaire now. Jamal is gone and I am going to be a single mother. I need a safe place for my baby. You have to give me the deed. It is the least you can do after letting them arrest my husband. I stared at her, marveling at the absolute delusion. Even after watching her husband get hauled away for a federal felony, her only concern was extorting real estate from the sister she had just tried to lobotomize. You are not getting the condo, Brittany, I said, my voice dropping to a flat, clinical tone. And frankly, housing is the least of your concerns right now. What do you mean? Brittany choked out, gripping her maternity dress. I looked between her and my parents, making sure they absorbed every single word. Jamal did not just forge a few bank papers. He committed massive federal wire fraud using Vanguard client funds. The Securities and Exchange Commission and the FBI are going to tear your life apart. They are going to freeze your joint bank accounts. They are going to seize your cars, your expensive jewelry, and whatever property you bought with stolen money. You are going to be investigated as an accessory because you just confessed in open court that you knew about the scheme to get my house. Brittany's eyes rolled back in her head and she sank onto the wooden bench, gasping for air. The reality of federal asset forfeiture had just vaporized her entire world. She was about to lose every single luxury she possessed. My father stepped forward, raising his hands in a weak, placating gesture. Cassidy, please, we have lost everything today. Can we just walk away from this and go our separate ways? I turned to face him, my expression hardening into absolute stone. Walk away. I repeated, the concept offending every fiber of my being. You do not get to walk away, Richard. You dragged me into a federal courtroom to destroy my life. You forced my hand. I picked up my purse and looked down at the three of them shivering in the empty courtroom. I am filing civil suits against all of you for defamation, emotional distress, and attempted grand theft, I announced. You wanted a brutal legal battle so desperately. Now you are going to get one against a corporate executive with an $85 million war chest. I am going to bleed you dry in civil court until you have absolutely nothing left. I turned my back on them and walked down the center aisle. Their terrified, hysterical sobbing echoed behind me, but I did not look back. I pushed open the heavy brass doors of the federal courthouse and stepped out into the bright Chicago sunlight. The crisp afternoon air hit my face, feeling cleaner and sharper than it ever had before. Behind me, the suffocating atmosphere of the courtroom, the desperate sobbing of my parents, and the shrill panic of my sister were permanently sealed away. I took a moment to just breathe. I was finally completely free. The nightmare was over. Ms. Kensington walked out a moment later, her premium leather briefcase swinging gently at her side. She stopped beside me on the wide marble steps and took a deep breath of the city air. She turned to me, a genuine smile breaking through her usual razor-sharp professional demeanor. That was a flawless victory, Cassidy, she said, extending her hand. They walked right into the trap and locked the doors themselves. You handled that with absolute perfection. I shook her hand, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. Thank you, Ms. Kensington, I replied, my voice steady and resonant. I could not have dismantled their empire of lies without your brilliance. We gave them exactly what they asked for. She nodded, adjusting her designer sunglasses. Jamal is looking at a minimum of 10 years in federal prison for wire fraud and perjury. As for your parents and Brittany, the civil suits will drain whatever meager assets the SEC does not seize. They will be social pariahs and financial ruins by the end of the quarter. Enjoy your freedom, Cassidy. You earned every bit of it. I watched her hail a cab and ride off into the bustling city traffic. Standing alone on the courthouse steps, I let the finality of the day wash over me. The toxic weight I had carried for 34 years was completely gone. I had spent my entire life trying to prove my worth to people who were only interested in extracting my value. They saw me as a target, a scapegoat, a failure they could exploit. Now they were the ones facing absolute devastation. Their sheer, unbounded greed had completely destroyed them. I walked down the steps and approached my parked SUV. The exact same SUV my family had tried to steal just hours ago. I unlocked the doors and climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the cool leather steering wheel. I started the engine, the deep, powerful rumble vibrating through the chassis. I pulled out into the busy Chicago streets, heading back to the multi-million-dollar company I had built from the ground up with my own two hands. I was returning to my real life, to my empire, and to the massive success they could never touch. If this experience taught me anything, it is this. Family is not about blood. Family is about respect. It is about who stands by you and who actually values you. And if the people who share your DNA ever try to put a price tag on your life, make sure you charge them everything they have. The harrowing courtroom ordeal of Cassidy serves as a powerful testament to a difficult but necessary truth-sharing DNA with someone does not automatically grant them the right to a place in your life, nor does it excuse systematic abuse. For decades, Cassidy's family operated under the toxic assumption that familial bonds provided a shield for their manipulative behavior. They believed they could diminish her accomplishments, tear down her self-esteem, and steal her hard-earned assets without facing repercussions. The profound lesson embedded within this narrative is the absolute necessity of recognizing your own intrinsic value and establishing uncompromising boundaries. Cassidy's triumph was not merely a legal victory, it was a profound declaration of self-worth. She demonstrated that true empowerment comes from refusing to internalize the false degrading narratives that toxic individuals project onto you. When her parents and sister attempted to weaponize her past exhaustion and portray her as a fragile, incompetent victim, she did not react with hysteria. Instead, she responded with the calm, calculated strength of a woman who had spent years building her own empire in the dark. This story teaches us that we are not obligated to set ourselves on fire to keep our relatives warm. When people who are supposed to protect you choose instead to become your predators, you have every right to cut the strings and walk away. True family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, genuine support, and unconditional love, not greed and manipulation. You owe nothing to those who view your existence merely as an opportunity for extraction, and walking away is often the ultimate act of self-love. If you find yourself suffocating in a toxic environment, take the first brave step today to reclaim your independence and build a life where you are truly respected.